Well, hello everyone. Good morning, yeah, thanks for showing up for this. Yeah, so the title is Left-Wing Communism: A Long-Established Disorder. Basically, I'm planning to speak a bit about Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, but then basically move into talking about Amadeo Bordiga's work. Partly with reference to the selection of his writings, which was published by Brill last year for the Historical Materialism series, and now it's out with Haymarket as well. And partly with reference to a book I'm still working on finishing myself, which will be the first English language biography of Bordiga. There's some construction noise in the background where I am. Is that some signal somehow, if that's okay? Yeah. Okay, so in a previous talk I gave was on the misuses of Antonio Gramsci, in particular in the tradition of the Italian Communist Party, or PCI, led by Palmiro Togliatti, basically from the end of the 1920s until his death in 1964. And part of the way in which the Italian Communist Party built up its cult of Gramsci, in particular during the World War II period, as it emerged from the resistance, the end of the fascist regime, into a parliamentary republic, and became a really mass organization. Part of the way it built up its cult of Gramsci was to erase from its origin story, its main founding leader, Amadeo Bordiga, as well as certain other figures who were clearly out of step with the party recreated during the World War II, and its kind of popular frontist politics. So we can also think of figures like Francesco Misiano, who were equally kind of memory hold, even though they played a decisive role in the original foundation of the party in 1921. Sometimes in Bordiga's case, this took the form of saying he was, a fascist who had set himself determinedly against the party. But in public-facing materials, it much more often just involved total silence, ignoring that he had ever existed, saying Gramsci had founded the party by himself or with Togliatti, this kind of thing. But the partial exception to this, the way in which members of the Italian Communist Party would kind of read about, study, talk about Bordiga, was the many party editions of Lenin's 1920 pamphlet, Left-Wing Communism. From now on, just to refer to the pamphlet itself, I'll call it LWC. And the essential message that militants were meant to take from LWC was, as against a kind of sterile obsession with defining the communists apart from other parties, or insisting on their purity of principle. The real way to build communism as a force, to build working class politics, was extreme flexibility of tactics. And basically, Lenin's pamphlet was taken as an embodiment of and an authority for this call. So, however distant from the real practice of the party in terms of the fact that during the war it literally made alliances with monarchists and bourgeois parties against fascism and so on. The idea was basically that the pamphlet stood for flexibility of tactics in general, as against the idea represented by Bordiga, which was that the party basically cohered itself and even its working class base precisely through its sharp counterposition to all other forces. And in particular, this is, I think, even beyond the Italian case specifically, probably this is the main way in which most people who are members of communist parties or Trotskyist organizations and so on, probably mostly, if they're familiar with Bordiga at all, it's precisely through the pamphlet Left-Wing Communism, and more specifically its focus on the question of parliamentary tactics. Of course, Lenin didn't suggest, as perhaps the wartime or post-war Italian Communist Party would have liked to claim, that the place for communists is fighting for reforms in parliament. But of course, left-wing communism, LWC, the pamphlet strongly criticizes the various elements of the post-World War I communist movement who rejected electoral participation. And Bordiga is often famed as a abstentionist, as an opponent of standing in elections, even as purely as a kind of propaganda platform. And yeah, there's no I mean, the faction he created in the Italian Socialist Party at the end of World War I, so between 1917 and up to January 1921, when the Communist Party of Italy was actually founded, the faction of which he was effectively the leader was called the abstentionist communist fraction. And it opposed participating in elections, insisting that a clear divide had to be drawn between the fight for the workers' state and then sort of various schemas then circulating at the time in Italy, ideas of creating a constituent assembly, or the idea that revolution would come from a socialist majority in the existing Chamber of Deputies, this kind of thing. At the same time, I think it's also important to strongly qualify the idea that Bordiga was in general an opponent of, or an on principle opponent of, electoral participation. Italy had first had more or less universal male suffrage in 1913. And at that time, when he was, in some of his early writings, I mean, Bordiga was, in 1913, Bordiga was only 23 years old. His writings at the time, in the build-up to the elections, are actually mainly characterized by a polemic against syndicalists and also anarchists, strong in the Italian left of the Italian workers' movement at the time, who supported electoral boycotts. Basically on the grounds that, and he argued against this, basically on actually quite similar grounds to the ones advanced in LWC a few years later. So, for instance, saying that, well, of course, it's true that all sorts of parliamentary combinations could be ruinous for Italian socialism. It's true that many workers who become MPs will become sort of unbound from their base, that in Parliament they won't indeed be able to effectively carry through reforms. All these kind of things are true. But nonetheless, the party should take the opportunity to stand in elections. As I said, talking about the 1913 Italian general election, the party should take the opportunity to stand in elections in order to present its program, in order to use the propaganda opportunity, and to do the most important thing, which was to combat the kind of apolitical sentiments among workers. Indeed, he further argued that basically, like, the syndicalist opponents of electoral participation were more often than not engaged in all kind of sort of opportunistic relations with straightforwardly bourgeois or otherwise reformist politicians. So the mere absence of the Socialist Party from the electoral field would do more to kind of miseducate its sort of potential real working class base than actually kind of galvanize them in some sort of critique of bourgeois institutions. Moreover, while in June 1920, sorry, July 1920, when LWC was presented before the second Congress of the Comintern, so just a few months before the creation of the Communist Party of Italy, even by that stage, the abstentionist communist fraction, so-called, actually included supporters of of revolutionaries running for parliament, including Francesco Misiano, who I mentioned, even like Antonio Gramsci attended its meetings and so on. And the party created in January 1921 did indeed stand in the general election, partly because that followed that spring, so partly because Bordiga wasn't the sort of dictator of the party, partly out of obedience to Comintern discipline. In fact, in the elections of 1921, the Communist Party of Italy, led by a supposed abstentionist, actually won more MPs than any other communist party in Europe had at the time. And then you can cite other examples as well. For example, in 1924, June 1924, when a reformist MP, Giacomo Matteotti, was murdered by the fascists, Bordiga had already been marginalized from the communist leadership, so was no longer really sort of compelled to defend Comintern line or discipline. But he actually argued against the communists quitting parliament in protest at the fascist murder, as indeed they and the other democratic parties did. He insisted that basically parliament could be used as a tribune. So I think it's important to strongly qualify the idea that left communism, or Bordiga particularly, are defined by anti-parliamentarism, or sort of an on-principle refusal of all electoral tactics, as a quite commonplace kind of trot and indeed Stalinist reading of LWC as a pamphlet might have it. The question was much more tactical and contingent. And actually, in 1960 to 61, Bordiga actually writes a pamphlet of his own. Well, it's a series of articles in Programma Comunista, which then appears in English as a pamphlet, which is called Left-Wing Communism, a Condemnation of Future Renegades. And here, Bordiga actually sort of insists that despite its normal political use, he indeed shared the essential political approach set out in left-wing communism, which wasn't only directed or sort of about electoral tactics specifically. Important in this sense also is when we talk about the communist left, the current that or the currents that emerged in the early Comintern period. There's a very well-established and recognized distinction to be made between the so-called Italian left, which more or less derives from the tradition of Bordiga, although certainly after like 1926 onwards, it develops quite independently of him in exile, but basically like a left communism that is basically a defense of Leninism. And then other currents, the so-called Dutch-German communist left. So if we think of figures like Anton Pannekoek, Hermann Gorter, Otto Ruler, Karl Korsch, and so on, who all in various ways reject the Bolshevik experience and Leninism. So in the Italian case, there's no equivalent of Pankhurst's Communist Workers' Party or the German KAPD, making anti-parliamentarism a kind of a split principle. This is also an argument about the nature of the Russian Revolution itself and its role as a model or otherwise. Of course, the opening chapter of LWC is about the general significance of the Russian Revolution, whether it's a model for the rest of the world to imitate, and in particular whether the forms it took, things like factory councils, Soviets, the party itself as a vanguard force, whether or not they should or needed to be imitated in other countries. And in his own writing on LWC, Bordiga strongly defends Lenin's own position, which is that the particular forms of the Russian Revolution can't be written off as owing to sort of local particularities or Russian backwardness or whatever, but nor is it a kind of new model. It in fact draws on the revolutionary traditions also of the 19th century. So in this view, the grandeur of Bolshevik experience owes to the fact that the party had been through all kinds of situations of both legality and illegality in a very condensed period, in particular through the learning process of 1905 and the repression that followed. So LWC damned parties in the West, like the Dutch, the left wing of the Germans, and so on, who attempted to draw general lessons from their own kind of first taste of harsher conditions, setbacks for democracy, and so on, in the late World War I period. So rather telling in this regard, I think, are the comments of Kautsky in his counterposition of sort of Bolshevik terrorism and dictatorship to a kind of idealized democratic, peaceful, bloodless course of the world revolution that could be launched in the West. In fact, in LWC, Lenin replies to this by citing Kautsky's own 1902 article entitled The Slavs and the Revolution, in which Kautsky predicts that the leadership of the European revolutionary process could indeed pass into Russian hands. And so Bordiga cites this in his own 1960 text. I'll quote, "When he, Kautsky, was a Marxist as far back as 1902, he wrote an article entitled The Slavs and Revolution, where he admitted that the guidance of European revolution might pass into the hands of Russian proletarians. After all, the revolutionary center had been in France in the first half of the 19th century, at times in England, in Germany in the second half of the 19th century. How well Karl Kautsky wrote 18 years ago," exclaimed Lenin in LWC. And today, Bordiga continues, "we can echo how well Kautsky wrote 58 years ago." So obviously speaking to a CPGB meeting about Lenin harking back to an earlier and better Kautsky, and then Bordiga harking back to Lenin praising Kautsky, I might run the risk of being sort of accused of trying to like force Bordiga into some sort of neo-Kaut revival. And of course, that would be absurd. I'm actually going to go on to talk about Bordiga's critique of Second International Marxism, which is, I would argue, deeper and wider than even Lenin's own. But I think in particular, this is a critique which is radicalized in the post-World War II period, when Bordiga is not really involved in sort of mass politics, but rather is engaging more directly with Marx's writings and actually studying Marx in a way which he hadn't in the sort of high phase of his direct political involvement in the 1910s and 20s. Indeed, while in his youth, Bordiga had drawn on the kind of cultural reference points of typical of Italian socialism of the time, and therefore also sort of bathed in Second International culture. I mean, you know, when you see Bordiga writing when he's 22 or 23 years old, you know, he's widely citing, you know, Ferdinand Lassalle and such like, which might be surprising if we take too literally his own claim to be sort of invariant. Yes, so I mean, basically, I think without wanting to establish any sort of firm epistemological break or anything like that, I think we can say that broadly, over time, there's a more radicalized critique of the SPD tradition and the Second International in two important ways, which are important to understanding also left communism as a broader phenomenon. One of which is the rejection of the idea that socialism is an extension of democracy or a kind of substitute or the completion of the values of the Enlightenment. And second, and related to that, is a rejection of the social democratic idea of political mobilization, and in particular of the idea of culture and education. Okay, so um, I think in this sense, it's also worth just to move away somewhat from the specific context of reactions to the Russian Revolution in the development of left communism, either in the sort of Italian Leninist variant or the Dutch German one. I think the broad thing that both types of currents have in common, despite their very different prescriptions, I mean, sorry to clarify, I mean, the Dutch German left arrived at conclusions such as, for example, political parties by their very nature are bourgeois, or that also focus on sort of local grassroots democratic control and this kind of thing, very absent from the Italian left. The thing that they both have in common is the idea that the 19th century workers' movement gave birth to a vision of socialism, which in fact amounted to a more effective integration of the working class into capitalism through its more rational or democratic or participatory management. So this is a critique which both types of left communists advance of both kind of Soviet type societies, that they are in fact not moving away from capitalism, but rather constructing the bases for capitalism, hence the prevalence of these kind of revolutions in as kind of developmentalist dictatorships in mainly non-European countries. But also it's a critique of social democracy as a means of strengthening capitalism by more efficiently and effectively integrating the masses into its political structures and even the structures for managing the economy, obviously most fully expressed in things like works councils in German industry and so on. But then I'll emphasize the idea is that the 19th century workers' movement gave birth to these things, not that it inevitably resulted in that, or that it was the only tendency at work. In his 1957 lecture, Fundamentals of Revolutionary Communism, Bordiga takes up this theme, identifying the kind of then popular ideas on the particularly on the Trotskyist left, but also among some anarchists and so on, with basically identifying those with the very ideas of the sort of utopian and petty bourgeois ideas of socialism critiqued by Marx. And again, in both cases, what he's criticizing is the idea that workers could like take over parts of capitalism, or that it could be sort of democratized, and then that would represent a step towards a communist society. So here he derides in the same breath the petty bourgeois socialism of figures like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, sort of defending small production units, a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, cooperatives, and this kind of thing. He identifies that with what he calls factory socialists, who are basically supporters of self-managed factories, workers taking over their own workplaces, notably the French group Socialisme Barbarie, which was kind of influential in the period of May 68. But he attacks those kind of also, as well as, but also in the same breath as his critique of Stalinist socialism and Stalin's idea that the law of value operates in socialist society, but there's like an exchange of equivalent values. He paints that as like the same idea as Proudhon's, and indeed echoes Marx's critique of Proudhon's kind of labor voucher schemes, these kind of things, where Marx says this is society as a whole conceived as an abstract capitalist. Basically, you can get rid of private ownership of the means of production, you can democratize or collectivize the economy, but it's nonetheless there's nonetheless industrialism building up capital and so on, even if in state or collective hands. Indeed, while Bordiga's remarks on Antonio Gramsci tend to be tempered by an element of personal sympathy, This argument is also directed against L'Ordine Nuovo, the paper which Gramsci ran together with Angelo Tasca and Palmiro Togliatti in post-World War I Turin. And then specifically it's directed against its councilist edge, like the idea that workers will take power by taking control of their workplaces and running them themselves. And this also kind of marks him apart from figures like Pannekerk, Jan Appel, Otto Ruler, as I said, the kind of Dutch-German left, who focus on these kind of like from below, who basically focus on kind of democratizing the economy, worker self-management and so on as a path to socialism. And this is also in Bordiga's 1960 text on LWC. He emphasizes his agreement with Lenin on this point, saying that revolutionary strategy isn't a matter of organizational forms. The slogan "all power to the Soviets" and the Soviet and so the Bolshevik leadership's reliance on the Soviets as a form of collective power relies on the party leadership therein. The real lesson of the October 1917 is that discipline and centralization are the fundamental factors for the working class to act as a political subject, not the idea of some sort of idea of like grassroots power or directly managing workplaces. Indeed, despite his sort of ultra-leftism, Bordiga was also a supporter of new economic policy. Here I'm not going to dwell too much on the Dutch-German left and councilism and so on. But I'm going to read a short passage from Bordiga's Fundamentals of Revolutionary Communism, which well captures the spirit of his position, his polemical style, and his rejection of kind of libertarian type positions. So, as I say, he's comparing Proudhon and Marx's poverty of philosophy to sort of latter-day calls for sort of self-management and so on. So Bordiga explains, along with his defective view of the revolutionary society, Proudhon is the precursor of the worst aspects of today's fashionable factory socialists. The rejection of party and state because they create leaders, chiefs, and power brokers who, due to the weakness of human nature, will inevitably be transformed into the privileged group, into a new dominant class or caste to live off the backs of the proletariat. These superstitions about human nature were ridiculed by Marx a long time ago when he wrote in a short pithy sentence, Monsieur Proudhon ignores that all history is nothing but a continuous transformation of human nature. Under this massive tombstone can be laid to rest countless throngs of past, present, and future anti-Marxist idiots. In support of our declaration, that not even the most minor restrictions can be placed on the full and unqualified use of the weapons of party and state weapons in the workers' revolution, and in order to get rid of these hypocritical scruples, we should add that in order to deal with the inevitable individual manifestations, the psychological pathology which proletarians and communists have inherited, not from human nature, but from capitalist society with its horrible ideology and individualist mythology of the dignity of the human person, there is only one organization capable of providing an effective and radical remedy. That organization is specifically the Communist Political Party. I mentioned that this was a text from 1957, an era in which Bordiga was principally concerned with the study of Marx, or as he put it, the reaffirmation of Marxian doctrine against renovators and falsifiers. Bordiga greatly enjoys the almost the kind of provocation of the language of doctrine, dogma. Another text from 1960 is called the Unchangeable Tablets of Stone. So the idea that like Marx, basically that Marxist doctrine, and he uses the word, has already been written. He often sort of refers to Marx and Engels as like Big Freddy and Uncle Carlo and so on, putting a quite strange tone on some of his writing. But the idea is really that nothing needs to be added all sorts of charlatans come along to say that they're improving on Marxism, finding kind of special cases and so on, advocating for localism or whatever. And Bordiga more or less dismisses all of this. But at the same time, as I wrote an article for the Weekly Worker last July, reviewing the new anthology of Bordiga's works in English, there are definitely new elements in Bordiga's post-war writing, in particular regarding a more developed rejection of Second International Marxism and what Lauren Goldner calls in a very interesting article, the substitute bourgeois revolution model of socialism. In his perspective, basically what the sort of enduring revolutions in the 20th century led by communist parties each did, which was not to transition away from capitalism, but rather to lay the bases of capitalist development in their respective countries, most obviously in the likes of China and Vietnam, but also, of course, in the sense that the bureaucracies of the Eastern Bloc countries transformed themselves into capitalist classes. And I think a strength of this sort of school of analysis is that it sees the Soviet-type societies as sort of constitutively unstable and in transition. The other side of that actually is that Bordiga also doesn't see, he sort of rejects the idea advanced by the likes of Karl Korsch that the Russian Revolution was just a bourgeois revolution. He sees contradictory processes where basically, like, the political revolution in the cities is a proletarian revolution, whereas what's taking place in the countryside is like laying the bases of the development of capitalism, right from the start of the revolution, and even visiting the Soviet state in its early years, including for the second Congress of the Comintern. Bordiga is very clear that there's nothing to idealize. They're not building the shining city on the hill in Russia. It's not like a model. It's a bridgehead of the world revolution, and even policies like NEP, the new economic policy, were fully defensible in the sense as they maintained open the opportunity for the revolution to spread. The idea of the substitute bourgeois revolution is essentially is quite similar to the idea of a kind of developmental dictatorship, and the idea that intellectuals in countries which were still had sort of hangovers of feudalism or in the colonial world would see something called socialism, like a centralized and dictatorial authority, as a kind of way of rapidly building up the productive forces of sort of shock industrialization. And in this, there's also a certain kind of like ecological critique of the Soviet model of industrialization. So for instance, if we think of, say, in Trotsky's "The Revolution Betrayed," he sort of argues, well, the political leadership of Stalin is counter-revolutionary and is going to lead the revolution to defeat, and predicts the collapse, that it will collapse in World War II and such like. But nonetheless, the planned economy shows the efficacy of socialism because of the growth rates, the rapid steel production and this kind of thing. I can't remember the exact quote, but Trotsky says something basically like the progress of socialism is being measured in tons of steel and concrete. And Bordiga sharply rejects this idea because it's production for human need not building up the capital of a particular state, which marks this the laying of the bases for a socialist society. But another key sort of flank of this rejection of the substitute bourgeois revolution model is that Bordiga rejects the idea that for the working class to become a ruling class, an idea very kind of dear to the kind of Gramscian tradition, that for the working class to become a ruling class, it has to kind of culturally prepare itself to lead and indeed sort of master the bourgeois culture. Of course, this, although this debate is well known because of Gramsci's particular theorization of hegemony and the sort of cultural dimension of politics. It's a very old debate in the workers' movement. Of course, if we think that the SPD had partly emerged from sort of workers' educational clubs created in the aftermath of the 1848 revolution in Germany, and there was always this like tension within that approach, within its kind of mass organizations, within its educational work. There's a tension between something more like, you know, what Rosa Luxemburg is doing in the turn of the 1910s, like let's take a small group of worker militants and turn them into cadres who've studied Marx, and then something much more like a sort of broad sort of civilizing mission is a harsh way of putting it, but yeah, like a broad mission of sort of raising the mass of workers, or at least the party's own followers, in a sort of mastery of science, of technique, of being basically prepared to inherit the Enlightenment tradition, to run society in a more rational way than the existing bourgeois elites. And you know, if we think of works like, for example, Andrew Bennell's study, Did They Read Marx, which is a study of the SPD's lending libraries, you know, we find that firstly, the single most read thing is just novels, and basically people, you know, getting free books they mightn't be able to purchase elsewhere, but also there's more interest in the hard sciences and even the works like Spencer and Darwin and so on, even than in popularizing works of socialist literature like, you know, Babel's Women and Socialism, and least of all, you know, workers like directly studying Das Kapital or whatever. So indeed, right from the start of Bordiga's political career, really actually the first way he becomes a sort of national figure or a widely known figure of Italian socialism is in 1912, is precisely in opposition to this kind of idea of raising the cultural level as a project of kind of like improvement of the masses, which will precede them being able to take power. And certainly in the debate in the socialist youth, which takes place in its Congress in 1912, mainly setting Bordiga against Angelo Tasca, is seen as somehow a kind of cipher for an argument about reformism, in the sense, is the party's task to build up an improved position for the working class within capitalism, or is revolution the precondition, as Bordiga argues, for seriously raising the cultural level of the masses, giving them the time, the resources, and so on, in which they can actually develop a proletarian culture rather than just be integrated in some small measure into the existing bourgeois culture. And Bordiga strongly rejects the idea that workers need to consciously or sort of need to be educated in the reasons why, like, workers don't need to be educated why capitalism doesn't work or is wrong or has exploitative effects or so on. but rather that he paints this almost as kind of instinctive, or something kind of learned through struggle. Certainly in the earlier phase of his writing, this is quite a commonplace idea. Actually, is that the workers like feel and see exploitation, and then bourgeois culture mystifies this and trains them in kind of individualist ideas and so on. He argues that in his famous saying, which is that to say that the working class needs to prepare itself through education is a slogan for a congress of school teachers, not a congress of socialist militants. And more particularly, it couldn't be maintained that workers needed to like break out of ignorance before they became militants, because what that would produce would be a party of middle-class humanitarian socialists. Bordiga was often cited the German ideology, and he would surely have made his own Marx and Engels description of the young Hegelian philosophers of the 1830s. So they write, I'll quote, once upon a time, a valiant fellow had the idea that men were drowned in water only because they were possessed with the idea of gravity. If only they were to knock this notion out of their heads, stating it to be a superstition, they would be sublimely proof against any danger from water. Nonetheless, while many of Bordiga's critiques of this kind of ideology of intellectual improvement and so on are well taken and often indeed I would say quite amusing, I think there's a real limit to this kind of way of theorizing political action, in particular as it relies heavily on the idea of a kind of subconscious militancy, which only needs to be somehow sort of brought out or indeed actually prevented from, or indeed sort of almost like saved from being corrupted by bourgeois culture. I'd say that I think broadly we can say that over the course of his writings, in particular in World War II, this sort of theme appears less and less, the idea of the kind of almost sort of the like goodness, or the sort of idealization of the kind of instinct of the working class. So earlier I referred to the kind of crude Stalinist hounding of Bordiga in the Italian Communist Party in the period kind of starting in the late 20s, including then his expulsion, continuing through World War II. So either calling him a fascist, or saying he did nothing against fascism while Gramsci was rotting in jail, or kind of more often just ignoring him entirely, like basically pretending he didn't exist. But in the sort of 50s, 60s, the rise of a more critical Marxist historiography, most notably the Revista Storica del Socialismo, a review including historians like Luigi Cortesi, Stefano Merli, working on the kind of early years of the Communist Party more seriously. That in turn sort of demanded that the Togliattian PCI produce something a bit more serious about Bordiga, and including a sort of basically sort of party biography of him by Franco Livorsi. And I think the most fruitful sort of vein of critique that this raised, and one which is worth taking seriously, is the argument that he basically in his political action remained trapped within the ideological coordinates of the Second International, even if from a critical position. And in particular, this meant associating him with so-called Maximalism, a tradition on the left of the Socialist Party through the 1910s, which mainly defined itself kind of negatively in terms of a rejection of betrayals and compromises and reformists, allied to sort of faith in the inevitability of revolutionary victory. And I use the word faith deliberately because this kind of language, which also Bordiga himself very often used, was cast in kind of quasi-religious terms. The faith, redemption, the betrayals and misleaders and renegades and so on. And although Bordiga sort of focuses on, so often asserts the sort of invariable and scientific character of his writings, a lot of his skill as an orator and as a figure who became a sort of mass leader actually did rely on a very kind of moral vision of socialism and the sort of purity of the proletariat against the various figures who would corrupt and mislead it. But at the same, I mean, in the period of World War I, maximalism was a kind of was a sort of current or set of groupings in the is almost more like a kind of mood than a real like an organized or theorized tendency. But it does take over the party in the immediate aftermath of World War I. And it's a classic expression of a kind of second international no man's land between real immediate political practice and then the proclamation of the revolution soon at hand. So in the immediate aftermath of World War I, this was very visible when in the 1919 general election, the Socialist Party was the biggest single party. Then, and then at the same time, there's like factory and land occupations going around across Italy. And basically the party doesn't organize this or lead it anywhere. It remains kind of patchwork of local groups. And kind of develops kind of quite, even its very main leaders develop quite kind of harebrained schemes for how the revolution could take place, but which don't involve any sort of immediate political action. So on the one hand, say Nicola Bombacci, who was one of the main leaders of Maximalism and attended the Second Congress of the Comintern, he advocated that once the Socialist Party had a majority in Parliament, it should declare that Parliament to be a Soviet. Or on the other hand, Giacinto Cerati, who didn't join the Communist Party in 1920, remained the main maximalist leader for the next couple of years. He advocated basically that like a couple of local councils should declare themselves to be Soviets, but on a kind of experimental basis, testing the water, as it were. And basically the foundation of the Communist Party was very heavily shaped by the idea to become more serious, to become more hardened, to become more seriously prepared for questions like military preparation and so on, partly also inspired by Russian example. I think in what we could call the high point of his involvement in mass politics, roughly from around 1911 to 1926, while Bordiga was a keen and aggressive critic of kind of idealists and utopias, calls for a fairer capitalism and so on, I think that the limitation of his perspective is this idea that the working class has a sort of inherent revolutionary instinct, which is being thwarted by misleaders and delusions, as if it could somehow be protected from the influence of bourgeois culture. And I think even his sort of opposition to taking part in the elections of the post-World War I period is also partly shaped by this kind of idea that the working class can kind of define itself as a force, can gain consciousness of itself by like having nothing to do with the bourgeois world. And I think it's insightful in this regard as a comment Lenin himself refers to in LWC, speaking not about Bordiga, but talking about Sylvia Pankhurst and her rejection of parliamentarism. And he refers to what he calls a temper of the like new communist militant, a sort of visceral proletarian hatred of bourgeois politics, a faith in the end goal, a kind of spirit which is kind of often dormant and needs arousing by organization, a faith and optimism in the end goal, hatred of the enemy, certain kind of moral elements, which, while necessary for mass organization, also aren't a kind of substitute for political strategy. And indeed, this is precisely the basis of the charge of infantilism, which is that in the new found communist movement, in the Communist International founded in 1919, the ultra-left currents are seeking to show their ardor and energy and anger and class hatred and so on, but lack the means to convert that from a tool of mass mobilization, from a tool of stirring up militant energy, into actually being able to do politics and turn their faith into action. And while Bordiga was, of course, certainly on Twitter and so on, is quite famous as a kind of armchair revolutionary and critic of action, and certainly in his post-war writings, he is very critical of the kind of cult of activism, of always needing sort of the immediate tactic, or to be immersed in mass politics all the time, so focusing on the necessity of study and programs and so on. I think actually in his experience as a mass leader in the period of World War I and after, it's actually quite surprising to see how often he is cast as a man of action on the side of the workers. I mean, I've drawn a comparison in a previous talk before, which is it's like a wood carving from, I think, the 1860s by a worker circle in Italy, which shows Karl Marx as a kind of on horseback, riding around Europe, spreading the revolution. It's like a Bakuninist idea of an insurrectionary, projected onto Marx. And often we find kind of quite similar things with Bordiga in the period of particularly 1921, 22, that he's actually at the center of all these kind of insurrectionary schemes and uprisings and so on, which, although I think not an accurate reflection of what he was actually doing, is somehow intertwined with the appeal he had as a leader. So, I mean, I think in this sense, I mean, some because of some of the discourse around class going on recently, people have been rereading an interesting article by G.M. Tamas, which was in Socialist Register in 2006, called "Telling the Truth About Class." And to say I am coming to an end quite soon. And "Telling the Truth About Class" is an interesting article because it counterposes what he calls a Rousseauian socialism, so in the tradition of Rousseau, but also shared by the likes of E.P. Thompson and so on, based on defense of the kind of moral integrity of the people, threatened by capitalist modernity, and also kind of asserting the kind of moral rectitude of the people and the kind of falseness of bourgeois culture. And as against that, in Tamas's view, a Marxist vision of socialism, which sees communism precisely as the result of the alienation process. So it's precisely because capitalism destroys the previous binds of community, precisely because it reduces us to rootless, atomized individuals, that is its revolutionary power. So not as in the tradition of Rousseau and Thompson, and also we could say Gramsci, which is the kind of popular common sense mobilized in opposition to capitalism, but it's actually the destructive force of capital which produces the revolutionary subject. And in Tamas's article, he portrays the left communists as the upholders of this second tradition. Basically, capitalism tears away the community, tears away the sort of veils and illusions, and reduces us to a kind of stark and barbaric state. And so while it's true that Bordiga certainly shares elements of this, including the slogan kind of "forward barbarians," the denunciation of bourgeois civilization, so the critique of the idea of socialism as a kind of a realized, a better, fuller version of bourgeois civilization. I think there's also a strong contradiction in his work between this this kind of moral dimension as a tool of political mobilization, and then his like analytical critique of kind of culture and self-improvement and so on. I'll finish just by saying that I think the Brill anthology of Bordiga's selected writings from last year. What's very interesting well, first in the texts themselves, but also in Pietro Basso's introduction, is the way in which it uses Bordiga to as a way of kind of asserting a sort of fundamental sort of ecological thread in so even in well, a third international Marxist, and in particular kind of overcoming a kind of fetishized idea of working class identity, or also of course because as I mentioned earlier, because of Bordiga's critique of the idea that socialism is workers taking over production, and really to reject the kind of idea of socialism as like better, faster, more rational industrialization, but rather as about overcoming the separations between humanity and nature, and so on. At the same time, I think the great limitation of Bordiga's work is the separation between the reality of his own political practice when he was really a mass leader, and then his kind of theorization of the leading role of the party, in particular because while he sort of continually, and in my view rightly, asserts the necessity of the party as a means of kind of overcoming, and the party's historic mission as a way of overcoming kind of sectionalism, localism, the petty interests of particular groups of workers and so on. I think he underplays the role that political education and culture can in fact have in building up militants who are able to see over that horizon, and in particular I think because while there's a distinction which is underplayed in his work between the idea of the working class needs to prepare itself in the like technique or of like how to master production as kind of councilist ideas, and then the idea of basically turning so organizing working class people in a way that can make people into political subjects with a horizon which isn't just limited to the the sort of cry of the empty stomach kind of thing. And I think in reality, even the Communist Party of the period where he was the effective leader actually also shows that. But I realized that in talking about everything Bordiga talked about, obviously covered the sweeping elements of the whole history of 20th century Marxism. Yeah, so I hope to made some cues which are of interest and that we can have a discussion about that.